flying saucers are real.
They've seen the aliens buzzing our missile silos.
The UFO phenomenon, either we like it or not, is already very much part of our reality.
That caused a compass needle to spin and spin.
And that's where the whole seed for the idea of underground bases at Dulce was planted.
They had very large eyes, and I found their stare extremely difficult to bear.
Hi, everyone. This is Martin Willis with Podcast UFO. Our guest today on episode number 47 is Chris Rutkowski from Canada. Interesting interview. I hope you hang in for that. Michael Lauka is joining me in a minute. A couple of quick announcements. We have Chris Lambright is going to be our guest star on our forum this week, beginning Saturday the 18th. You can post questions on the day before, the 17th. Now, Chris Lambright is known for doing the book called X Descending, which is basically a story on some of Ray Stanford's footage of UFOs, and also the infamous Paul Bennewitz case. So you can pose a lot of questions regarding the Bennewitz case. I hope you participate. Our Facebook page continues to be very active. I hope you partake in that. We have Peggy that's running that. Thank you, Peggy. And we've had some donations. I want to thank Katie for a donation, and Matt also for a donation this last week. Thank you very much. It's what keeps the show going. I guess we're ready to roll into the news. How are you doing, Michael?
Great. How are you this week?
Great. So what is happening?
First of all, the English language version of the China Daily website reports that a recent UFO sighting in China was actually a research rocket launched by the Chinese Academy of Science. The May 13th launch was part of an aerological sounding program. You can read the original article, which includes some interesting photographs of the rocket, through the links in our show notes. And yes, that is an English article.
Okay. Well, there is still a lot of interesting UFO sightings in China going on. I'd like to know more about that. I actually do communicate with Mark Sima, who was a past guest on this. He's right in Beijing. But there's a lot going on there. It's interesting.
Yeah, I actually first came across this the day before on a Chinese website as a UFO sighting, and then the next day it was all cleared up. But it's worth popping by and seeing the photographs because they might not exactly look like people expect a rocket to look.
Wow. And speaking of clearing up, there was something that we reported a few weeks ago, or maybe last week, I'm not really sure about, a yellow and blue UFO that went under a plane. Remember that on December 12th or something?
Yes, near Glasgow.
That's right. That might have been a helium shark that some kid let go. Did you hear about that, Michael?
Well, you sent me that, so I heard about it. I'm not sure I buy that because wouldn't a balloon just be completely sucked into jet engines?
Oh, you mean sucked in? Well, it could be. It depends on,
or just blown, by the turbulence and everything created. One would think it would not be an impressive event, although it would be definitely fairly strange to look out one's pilot window and see a helium shark.
You'd have to set that to Jaws music.
Yeah. The NBC News website recently ran an article on Dr. Howard Sonny White, a physicist whose experiments may prove that warp drives are possible. Although the obligatory Star Trek references are included, the article is actually a very readable summary of the warp bubble theory, a loophole in Einstein's theories that would allow practical faster-than-light travel without technically allowing actual faster-than-light travel. You can read it through the link in our show notes.
Yeah, it's really, we talked about this before in a different scope, but it's actually like the space is moving around the object or something. It's very strange. It's interesting.
Yeah, this is a theory that's been around for a while, but I thought this was a pretty good version for someone who might be intimidated by, the science speak that you usually get with these things. In his testimony before the citizen hearing on disclosure panel, retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard French stated that he had not only seen UFOs in 1952, but actually saw alien creatures that were apparently repairing a downed craft. French further claims that at the time he was assigned to the fledgling Project Blue Book as an investigator. You can read more about the incident, which occurred in Newfoundland, in Lee Spiegel's article, which we've linked to in our show notes. Spiegel's piece also contains video excerpts from French's rather remarkable testimony.
I think it's called Newfoundland.
Fine. Yeah, it is. I know. I realized that halfway through.
That's okay.
Would you like me to say that again? Which occurred in Newfoundland.
No, don't worry about it. I think I'm going to just cheese you instead.
You're only doing that because you're hundreds of miles away.
That's right. I read through that blog, and there's a comment by, who's the guy that's always smiling, Open Minds?
Alejandro Rojas?
That's it.
Yeah.
I read the comment by him, and he kind of says there's a lot of falsification in regard to French's testimony. If someone's reading this post, you should scroll down away until you get to his posting. It's interesting.
Yes, actually related to that, also in 1952, I'd like to mention this week's blog post was inspired because of the recent death of Ray Harryhausen. It's 5 films from the 50s that have a kind of give you a window to the times and to the views on flying saucers. And one of them is actually a docudrama from the 50s about the 1952 incidents over Washington, D.C., which, I mean, was right there at that time and had a major influence on how Project Blue Book was run.
Well, that's great. I can't wait to read that, Michael.
And finally, as this week's episode will be focusing on Canada, it is worth mentioning that according to the Winnipeg Sun, the Ufology Research Annual Report states there were 1,981 sightings in Canada in 2012. That is an increase of slightly over 200% from 2011, which previously held the record for most Canadian UFO sightings. According to the report, the majority of the sightings were from the province of Ontario. You can read more about it through the link in our show notes, or just stay tuned and hear more about UFOs in Canada from this week's guest, Chris Rutkowski.
Yes, we do go right into that whole report. It's very interesting. A very good show. I hope you stay tuned. And so, Michael, is that it for the news today?
That is it for this week's news.
We have Chris Lambright coming on as a guest star to our forum. And thank you, Michael, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, I'll talk to you next week.
How you doing, Chris?
Very well, and yourself?
Great. And you're in Manitoba?
I am, yes.
The one reason I wanted to contact you right away, and I was glad you responded to me, was I understand the Canadian federal government sends all the UFO sighting information right to you?
When something comes into Transport Canada or to National Defense and occasionally the RCMP, I will get some reports coming in. It's not a lot, but we certainly do get some. Just
before we started recording, you started to tell me about something that was released today. Can you talk about that?
Right. Well, since 1989, myself and my colleagues have been doing an annual study called the Canadian UFO Survey. And what we do is we collect all the reports that are available from all sources, both from government and official sources, but also from civilian groups that come directly to media, and of course those that come to civilian investigators and to ourselves. And we put it all into one study, so we get a snapshot of what people really are reporting, at least in one country. And it's quite unique. When we began doing it in 1989, we were the only organization that was doing this, looking at one country completely. And we found that the number of reports kept going up every year. And in 2008, we reached what we thought was a record level, which was more than 1,000 UFO reports that were reported in Canada in 1 year. Wow. And after 2008, the reports, they continued around about 900, 950, almost to 1,000. But last year in 2012, and we've just released our report, which went live today, there were almost 2,000 UFO reports in Canada in 1 year, which shatters all records, and we're quite surprised to find such a high number.
Is there anything besides the phenomenon that might be attributed to this? Was there anything that people were outside special for? Was the weather different or anything like that?
No, I can't say. We're trying to figure out exactly what the differences are attributable to. We were suggesting that perhaps there were more military exercises, not to our knowledge. We thought perhaps, like you say, the weather phenomenon, and the weather was about the same as it's been over the past number of years. We thought perhaps there's a media influence, but of course it's long been a long time since the X-Files were on TV, and even though there's some shows called UFO Hunters and so forth, not really as popular as would tend to explain the huge increase. We do know that a significant number, several hundred of the reports, are certainly of Chinese lanterns, and we could explain quite a few of the orange orbs bobbing along in 2s, 3s, 4s, and 10s as cases like that. But overall, the increase was an increase reported to all sources, so to Peter Davenport's National UFO Reporting Center, to sightings.com, to MUFON. Everywhere reported an increase in the number of UFO sightings that were reported to them. And so it's a definite increase in the number of actual sightings that are reported. So it is curious. We're not entirely sure what this can be explained as, but it's a very interesting phenomenon.
When you sort through these, would you say that the amount of unexplainable UFOs is right there on a percentage-wise as far as it usually is?
Actually, we do tend to analyze as much as we can with the data that we have. In fact, my colleague Jeff Dittman produces charts and tables, and actually the data itself is available on our website for anyone to look at. And we've done some graphs and charting to show increases and decreases and how things are related to one another. We do separate into explained cases, possibly explained cases, insufficient evidence, and unknowns. We separate in terms of color, shapes of objects reported, provinces, the locations, time of day. We try to include as many variables as we can. In terms of the unexplains, we've been running somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10% unexplained over the past number of years, and we've dropped a little bit in 2012. It's down to about 7.5% that are unexplained. We're not sure exactly what that may be attributable to either. However, we do know that fewer and fewer cases are actually investigated. It's very common that people are focusing now on things like, disclosure and government cover-ups and that type of thing, and fewer people are actually spending the time investigating actual UFO reports. And as a consequence, we can't, completely explain or otherwise account for a lot of the information that we're getting from witnesses. Many are not being followed up adequately from various organizations. So the number of adequately investigated reports is going down dramatically, and that probably accounts for the number of unexplained cases going down as well.
I see. Now, what is your website address?
Well, there are several ways to get to us. The main survey website is survey.canadianuforeport.com. So again, that's survey.canadianuforeport.com, and that takes you to a landing page where you can go to charts, tables, what's called the essay page, which is the yearly study, which gives summaries and various analyses and descriptions, plus some case details as well. We also have a blog. It's uforum.blogspot.com. That's uforum.blogspot.com, which is my own personal blog, and there's a version of the survey on that page as well.
Right. Now, what would you say the most common type of shape, let's say, of a UFO? Is it saucer, is it triangle in some of these reports, orbs? What is the most common one?
Well, when you look at all of the data, and that's what takes us so long. It's already May, and it took this long to sort through all the reports. Since we had twice as many, it took twice as long. You do tend to get a good picture of what people are reporting and actually seeing. The most common UFO report is simply a light in the sky, and last year, the most commonly reported color was either white or orange. And it's just a light seen in the nighttime sky. The peak is somewhere around 11 o'clock in the evening. and it moves in an erratic fashion that the witness believes, suggests it's not an aircraft or a balloon and so forth. So that's the typical case. If we do look at daylight discs, we do tend to see some disc-shaped objects, but in general, the classic Hollywood flying saucer and the meat and potatoes of ufology from the 60s and 70s is largely gone now. We do have more triangle sightings, although we are getting some very interesting, disparate kind of shapes. Last year there were octagons reported. There were many rectangles for some bizarre reason. Square objects. Is a very, very unusual year in terms of the UFO shapes. So we are getting some very, very unusual cases.
Wow. I have a friend that he lives in Montreal. They were out on their back deck at a party. There was a whole group of people, around 20 or so. They heard these fighter jets up in the sky, and they watched them chasing a disc. And then what was most astonishing to him is that they never saw anything in the paper. And he said that his friends didn't want to talk about it.
Well, it is interesting that media are tending to shy away from the UFO phenomenon. Maybe they've just got an overload or something like that from a lot of the discussions that have been going on. It used to be where a UFO sighting was front page news in a lot of small town newspapers, which would later get picked up by larger cities. Not so the case anymore. In fact, we're finding fewer cases being reported in media, despite the fact that the number of sightings and reports is actually going up. So people are shying away from reporting them to media, but are reporting them more to UFO organizations, which is interesting. But I guess in the internet age, it's easier to Google, UFO sighting report or something like that, and get directed to a way in which you can report something anonymously.
When I had a sighting back in 2006, I had no idea where to go. And the funny thing is I never even thought of going to the internet and reporting it that way. It just didn't occur to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, people are reporting them still report them to police occasionally.
That's what I did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so people still do that. They report them to airports. In Canada, it's called Transport Canada. In the United States, it's FAA. And people still make those reports, but it's becoming rarer. It seems that it's a lot easier, and I suppose a lot safer when one thinks about anonymity, to report it to a UFO reporting center and just tap in your details into an online report form, and then it's gone. The trouble with that is if you do it anonymously and don't provide contact information, there's no way of following up. So if you had a very interesting case that seems very worthwhile and very, very puzzling, there's no way to follow up. And as a consequence, we're unable to follow up as well with witnesses. And it really takes some detective work sometimes to track down individuals who had seen things.
Do you come across this quite a bit?
Yes. In fact, two of the cases which we labeled last year as high-quality unknowns. And what happens is we look at all the cases that were noted as unexplained, and then we go through them all to sort out which ones are, the higher-quality ones. In other words, which ones do we have a lot of information on? Which ones did the witnesses actually meet with investigators? Maybe there were drawings, perhaps photographs. Perhaps they were reported to official reporting agencies like the military or so forth. So things that really do tend to stand out. And there were two cases last year which were very remarkable. This is the one I mentioned about a hexagonal or octagonal object that was seen moving at very close range by a family that was driving in a car. And at the time of the report, which goes back to January of 2012, I remember speaking with the individuals a number of times. Investigators went out with them and talked with them, met them at their home, went to the location where the sighting occurred. It was, we were very puzzled by it. And when I was compiling this report, I thought, well, I'll go back and talk with them and see if they had any additional ideas. And their phone's out of service, their email's bouncing, and can't get a hold of them anymore. So it is very, very frustrating sometimes as a UFO investigator trying to get more details from witnesses.
I bet. Now, when I think of Canada, I think of Wilbert Smith. There's been a lot of writing in books that I've actually read that said that he had a connection with the United States government and actually knew a lot of things that was going on here. Do you have any information in regards to that?
Well, yes. His papers are available on file, and his books are quite interesting to read. His family was very open with sharing with investigators about some of the details of his life, and it was one of his top secret memos, which detailed how he went down to Washington to talk with some Americans in the military. And he reported back to his superiors in Ottawa, and it was his memo that Stan Friedman and others located, which laid out the sort of the Bible of disclosure and cover-up, where he noted, according to what he was told, that flying saucers were classified higher than the H-bomb, and that it's of utmost interest in top secret classification. So a lot of these documents are available, and he was the person who was kind of in charge of what was then called Project Second Story. There was also an earlier Project Magnet. He was trying to understand propulsion of these objects if necessary, and he had actually had a little observatory. Now, unfortunately, it was not official. In fact, he had done it on his own time and was not authorized by the government in any way. But he set up a little observatory in Ontario where he was monitoring for fluctuations in magnetic fields, and at least on a few occasions thought that he had detected the presence of flying saucers flying over the observatory. So it was a very interesting. He was a very interesting character. In fact, he very knowledgeable electrical engineer. Some of his patents laid the basis and foundation of a lot of systems that were used up until very, very recently. Very knowledgeable, and he was firmly convinced that flying saucers were visiting Earth, and that there were communication going on between the occupants and various governments. So, very interesting person, and a lot of the documents are available to look at. So it makes you scratch your head and wonder, well, what really was going on? Was this something that he himself was being led to believe by others? Was he, perhaps, led down the garden path by his own beliefs, or was something really going on? Nevertheless, the fact that some of the people he interviewed were later found to be part of the MJ-12 conspiracy, and it led to many other document retrieval cases that followed after that. So it's interesting that a lot of what we know about retrievals and disclosure come from a basis in Canada from the 1950s and 60s.
That's right. And didn't he actually claim that he actually handled some UFO hardware?
There was a number of there's something called the Ottawa chunk, or the Ottawa chunk of metal. Something had fallen into the Ottawa River, and he had retrieved it and done some analysis, or rather had somebody do some analysis on it. And it was long believed by the group which in existence at the time, the Ottawa Flying Saucer Club, that this was in fact a piece of space hardware. Curiously, in 1960. Although the document wasn't discovered until a few years ago now, there's an interesting report of a hunter and fisherman who was dropped off to do some remote hiking in the Northwest Territories, and he saw an object fall from the sky, twirling around very, very quickly, fall into a lake not far from him, and spun around until it eventually slowed down and vanished underneath the water. Now that once the information about this incident reached RCMP and the National Defense, it was investigated by the Canadian government, and we don't know exactly whether anything was recovered or not. We know that there was a recovery operation that's in a very isolated location, but as far as we know, nothing actually was recovered from that area. And this is about the same time that Smith said that something had fallen, and they recovered it in Ottawa, which is quite some distance away. So there were some interesting cases that were investigated and known about at the time, but the 50s and 60s were very active in Canada for sure. And it's interesting that here we are, another 50 or 60 years later, and we're getting more and more UFO reports in Canada again. So perhaps it's an indication of things to come.
Right. There was a major sighting in Canada a number of years ago. Can you talk about that?
Well, there's a couple that come to mind. One was Shag Harbor, which I think some of your listeners will know about, where an object was seen to fall into the ocean. And it was witnessed by a number of people, and RCMP had also seen it, and they commissioned some fishermen to get out because they thought perhaps it was a downed aircraft or whatnot. But they went out into the ocean, and they found this green glowing foam on the surface of the water, which was very, very puzzling. That they didn't know, what might have caused this. It apparently was investigated. There were a few documents generated about. We do know that this actually happened and that something actually occurred. And there's a rumor going around that perhaps something was taken by the United States Navy underneath the ocean and taken to a remote site without being seen. We don't know whether that actually happened or not, but we do know that something actually occurred and was investigated on a number of levels. The other case that some people may be familiar with happened in Falcon Lake in 1967, the same year, curiously enough, where a prospector was doing some examination of a rock vein, a quartz vein, in May of 1967, and he saw a Hollywood-style flying saucer land on a rock outcropping not too far away from him, and he walked up to it, touched the side of it, was burned by it, and the blast of hot gas shot out from an exhaust vent, setting his clothes on fire and causing severe burns. And he was taken to hospital and examined by doctors, and eventually went to the Mayo Clinic too for examination, where doctors were mystified by his condition. So a number of very, very unusual cases with physical evidence have occurred in Canada. It's interesting that it's just a matter of about 75 to 80 miles away from the United States border that a lot of these cases were occurring. Wasn't
there a really large craft seen by two different people driving around a lake or something like that?
Actually, it's a very remarkable case. Back in 1996, there were more than 36 witnesses who were eventually located of one single object, or what was believed to be one particular object, that was seen moving very slowly and ponderously over a lake in the Yukon. Mm-hmm. And this was only uncovered after some excellent detective work by a Canadian UFO researcher named Martin Jasek. He had heard about something unusual occurring in the Yukon and was living up there at the time, and happened to talk to somebody who knew one of the witnesses. Spoke to the witnesses, and then did what some of us as UFO investigators do. He went on what's called a dig, which is where you go from town to town to town to try and find additional witnesses to objects. And he found, as I mentioned, 36 witnesses scattered across many miles, unrelated to one another, had not actually spoken with one another, all describing a very, very large object on this particular date in 1996, moving slowly over the lake from one end to the other. A number of people were driving on the lake. In fact, one interesting couple of witnesses were actually cousins. One was driving about a mile ahead of the other, and they both stopped their cars a mile apart and watched as this very large object passed directly overhead one of them, and then from an oblique angle from the other one. Wow. So we do have a perspective here. We do know that some debunkers have explained the entire series of sightings as due to the re-entry of a Russian rocket. Of course, that wouldn't be explained by these particular sightings because it was seen from two particularly different angles over the course of a mile or so. And many people saw windows, very great number of lights, and the sightings lasted quite a long time, in the order of 10, 15, 20 minutes. So we do know that a very large object was seen, and it was witnessed by a lot of people, to the point where the case was actually brought up in the Yukon government's proceedings, where a question was raised about this. and filed officially by a legislator wanting to know more about what had really occurred. So it's been studied at a lot of levels, and to have so many witnesses to such a remarkable case is very, very unusual.
I'll say. That is amazing with the windows and all. Now, speaking of being so close to the United States, we have a lot of abduction accounts here. And I just wondered, what is that like in Canada?
Well, over the years, I've had quite a few people come to me with abduction stories. My view is actually that abductions are probably not the realm of ufology. And the reason I say that is, in at least a good percentage of the cases that have come to me, people are experiencing very high anxiety because of what had occurred. A few attempted suicide because they felt that the aliens were monitoring them and so forth, and are feeling very hopeless. At least one or two of the cases that I encountered in terms of women had some screen memories that eventually turned out to be because that they had been raped and experienced some very brutal life-threatening experiences. And once you get into these types of psychological and severe psychopathology, I really think ufology has no right to be in abductions. And I have referred many of my cases to clinical psychologists because once you're dealing with people who are emotionally scarred, it's time to call in professionals. Having said that, because a lot of abductees do go to ufologists as an initial screening process, I think it's very useful to talk with people. And sometimes people just need to talk with another person about some of their experiences to relieve their anxieties. And I think that some ufologists might very well, serve this role very effectively. So I'm of two minds in this, and I think that it's an interesting phenomenon. I think that in one of my books, which is called Abductions and Aliens, I detail a lot of cases that occurred, many of which occurred in Canada. Many professionals who have come to me with no psycho or obvious psychopathology that say that they had been, taken aboard, taken and examined, things coming into bedrooms, the entire spectrum. And on the other hand, I encountered many cases which people did experience or exhibit some psychopathology. So I think it's something that does bear examination, but I think it's something that the medical profession should be taking a closer look at. And unfortunately, because of some taboos, it's very difficult to get medical researchers and clinical investigators to take a look at abduction cases.
Mm-hmm. When I first started this podcast, I had in mind that I wasn't going to tiptoe into the abduction part of it at all. And then I started thinking about, I grew up right near the Betty and Barney Hill incident, and actually right in the next town over. And then I started thinking, well, if I believe in one part of it, how could I not actually explore the other part of it? Kathleen Martin and Denise Stoner, who just published a book, are going to be on in a few weeks, and we're going to talk about that. It is interesting. I do partially agree with what you say, but I just don't know if there's really a connection. Some people are under the idea that we are being examined. I just don't know for sure. It's just as baffling as ufology to me.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. We simply don't know. And I think we do need more individuals to study it. And Kathleen's perspective on her aunt's case is very fascinating, and I think that'll be a very interesting show. She does have some very unique perspectives, and coming from a clinical psychology viewpoint as well. So I think it's definitely worth pursuing, and I think the jury's still out on a lot of the aspects of what the phenomena really are. It's interesting you're mentioning that, you got interested in various aspects, and you're sort of drawn into two particular facets. When I first began studying UFO reports back in the 1970s, at that time, I had, put the word out that I was interested in people's stories, and people started coming to me and saying, I didn't actually see a UFO, but, I may have seen a ghost last night, or, I saw a Sasquatch or something like that. And I started being more Fortean in my approach, and People like Jerome Clark are on the right track when they start looking at a lot of very disparate phenomena. The trouble is there's so many different facets you can be involved with that you might have to pick and choose eventually. And I withdrew generally from the parapsychology and the psychic investigations, and even more lake monster and Bigfoot investigations, simply because there's just not enough time in the day to do even the ufology that we're doing. Mm-hmm. But there's been some interesting overlaps. I mean, I remember going out on an investigation trip where I was interviewing people in a particular area in Canada where a lot of UFOs were being reported. And I had spoken to one person who said, "Oh yeah, I saw one on this particular day. I saw this light on this day," and go down the road and talk to another person, and they said, "You should really talk to Mr. Smith over there in that other farmhouse." And I drove down the road and I spoke with him, and I talked with him about had he seen any UFOs, and he said, "Oh no, he doesn't believe in that sort of thing. I hadn't seen any UFOs." And I apologized, and I said, "Well, I thought that you may have seen something." He said, "Oh no, nothing like that." I said, "Okay, well, I'll leave you to whatever you're doing." He said, "Oh, I'm just doing some dowsing for some wells." And I thought, well, that's a bit unusual. And I said, do you want to tell me about that? And he still started telling me about that. And then it came out that he himself had seen some ghosts and experienced some poltergeist activity. So there's an overlap, in that sense, that it never occurred to him that some of the lights he was seeing, ghost lights and spook lights and that type of thing, were related to UFOs. And then in terms of other realms, I remember investigating another series of UFO reports in one particular town, and had asked people about had they seen anything else unusual, and nobody had seen anything. Got back to the city and found a light on my answering machine blinking, and it turned out that somebody had seen a Sasquatch a half a mile away from where somebody had seen a UFO. And then, it's very bizarre that you get this overlap of these different types of phenomena. And whether that's a real overlap or simply coincidence is really quite fascinating, and that's worth some Fortean studies. So I think there's a lot of grist for the mill here for people to do a lot of interesting scientific research, and it's simply not being capitalized on. I mean, the number of UFO reports that we had in Canada last year, almost 2,000, that represents a lot of people. In fact, we've done some polls and surveys where we found, very similar to Gallup polls, where about 10% of the population, both the United States and Canada, believe they've seen UFOs. That's a lot of people. Mm-hmm. In the United States, you're looking at 30 or 40 million people who believe they've seen UFOs. Surely that's enough for some sort of study and some investigation, whether we're looking at a real physical phenomenon or a psychological phenomenon that's affecting millions upon millions of Americans. So I think there's a lot of scientific research that needs to be done, and one of the ways that we think that we can, communicate and bridge the gap between science and the lay community is with a study like the Canadian UFO Survey, where we actually provide the data. We enter it and allow people to see the different types of demographics that we can get. We can look at hourly distributions, time and space distributions, and so forth. And I think there's a lot of information that can be produced in this way, because when you speak to somebody who's very skeptical or debunks UFOs, you ask them if they've ever looked at data. Chances are they haven't, and the reality is that we have 2,000 cases from last year alone in Canada since we began doing this survey back in the late 1980s. We have more than 12,000 UFO reports that are now in a database. And, it's there simply for people to look at. Do with it as you may. Pick out the information that you need. This is a way of conveying to the scientific community the information is there. We're not saying that this is a database of 12,000 contacts with alien spaceships. We are saying that this is what people are reporting. And I think it's time that people take a closer look at the phenomenon.
I agree 100%, and I thank you for that. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed our talk today, and I'd like to have you on again sometime if you're up for it.
Sure, would certainly love to.